We're continuing to walk our way through the New Testament, and this morning we have arrived in the Gospel according to Luke. And I love Luke. I love the way that Luke presents us with a picture of the Savior, how he introduces us to Jesus, some unique things about Luke that really make it a special gospel to me. I love the way that Luke introduces us through the birth of Jesus and actually gives us a very rare snapshot into Jesus as a young man, a boy who is left behind, so to speak, or stays behind to speak to those around him, and they're amazed that such a young man speaks the way that he does, and his parents come back and get him. And as I said, it's kind of a unique picture of Jesus, because we don't read much about his childhood or his adolescence in the Gospels at all. So Luke has some interesting things about it. Luke also, as you read through Luke, has some passages that overlap, some passages that are shared in the Gospels, some of the teachings of Jesus, some of the situations, the events, the miracles you'll find that are in common with other Gospels. I've chosen a passage that is also emphasized in other gospel readings, not just in the book of Luke. But I've chosen it because it is such an important passage for us in terms of what the gospel means to us. Because I believe the gospel is at the very center of how we live our lives. The gospel is the very essence of who we are in Christ. The good news about who Jesus is, the good news about what he has done for us, the good news about how he is at work in our lives and produces growth, development, maturity as a follower of Jesus. I want to talk about that today. And I have two questions to ask you to begin with. Just direct questions. First of all, is your life fruitful? Is your life fruitful? Now that's a biblical expression that you'll find in several places. But I would say to you that though it is expressed in different ways, it's a very common question today. I love to read. I love to read about books that are challenging and try to get at the heart of issues in our lives today. And I will tell you that it is in almost every book at some place in the books that I enjoy reading. It's somewhere in there, there's going to be some exploration about purpose, about fulfillment, about direction, about vision, about passion, about how you live your life and what gives your life meaning, about your identity. These are very popular subjects in our lives today. The Bible speaks to those kinds of questions by speaking about fruitfulness. Fruitfulness. So I'm going to ask you this morning, when you look inside, when you look in the mirror, when you invite God to help you to evaluate and assess your life, is your life fruitful? Second question I want to ask you is your life strong enough to withstand the storms of life? Is your character, we're talking about foundation in just a moment, but I want to just boil it down to that. Is your life strong enough to withstand the storms of life? Because it's not a matter of if storms will come. It's not a matter of whether or not you will encounter challenging times in life. We know, as the Bible says, it's going to rain on the just and the unjust. We know that everyone will experience a storm in life. Everyone. Different types of storms. We don't always experience the same kinds of challenges, but all of us will experience challenges in life. And so the question becomes, am I strong enough? How will I hold up? Will I be able to withstand the storms that come my way? Now, there are two passages that I want to look at, both found in the 6th chapter of Luke. In Luke chapter 6, beginning in verses 43, 44, and 45, and then the verses that follow. I want to read those two passages to begin with, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what they say. As you look at verse 43 of Luke chapter 6, the first thing that Jesus wants to teach us is that life is like a tree. My life is like a tree. And look what he says. He says, verse 43, "For a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good. And an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks." Life is like a tree. Life is like a tree. But life, according to Jesus, is also like a house. So let's continue reading. Verse 46. "But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say? Whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I will show you whom he is like. He's like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently against that house and could not shake it, for it was founded on the rock. But he who heard and did nothing is like a man who built a house on the earth without a foundation, against which the stream beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great." So we have a tree and we have a home builder. We have a tree and we have a construction project. We have a tree and we have a house that is built to illustrate to us some things about life. Is your life fruitful? Is your life fruitful? And is your life built in such a way? Have you built your house in such a way that it can withstand the storms of life? Let's talk a little bit about that today. There is so much that Jesus is able to teach through a very simple illustration. I guess of all the things that amaze me in the gospel, one of the things that amazes me most is a story like this first story where Jesus takes something that is so familiar to them. He takes some tree that is immediately recognizable to them, and he makes it into a life lesson with profound implications for us today. He teaches us with such a depth from just a simple illustration, simple to understand, but how well do we apply it? He says this. He says life's like a tree. And when I read that and when I look at his picture, the first thing that sort of bubbles to the top for me when it comes to a lesson that I want to take away today is, as he explains, a good tree produces good fruit, an evil tree produces evil fruit, and he goes through all that. At the end of the story, he tells us something that we need to get a hold of today more than ever, and that is that fruitful living, fruitfulness, purpose, fulfillment comes from the heart. Did you catch that? That it is out of the treasures of your heart. Jesus, he just seamlessly transfers what he's talking about from a tree that produces fruit to a life that produces good. He just moves quickly from this picture of a tree into life. And what he says is this: if you want a good life, a fruitful life, a productive life, a fulfilling life, if you want the kind of life that God wants you to have, you have to understand something, that production comes from the treasures that you place in your heart. Now, why that's so important today, if I think about that, is that fruitfulness is on the outside. I love my mom and dad. for a lot of reasons, but I love them today because they brought some peaches to my house yesterday. And so this morning, Phil, they were good. The kind of peaches you can make cobbler with. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, batter, brown, buttered, cinnamon. And how many times have I said butter so far? Butter, big old ice cream right there. That's what I'm talking about. That's the kind of peaches I'm talking about. Of course, I'm a diabetic, so I just had peaches on my cereal. But boy, let me just tell you, they were good. Now, here's the thing about it. That peach that I ate this morning was completely removed from the tree. I never saw the tree. I never saw the soil. I don't even know where it was grown. And I think sometimes we get caught up on the fruit that is visible in the moment, and Jesus forces us to think more deeply about our lives. He says that if you want to talk about fruitfulness, you have to get beyond the fruit and realize that fruitful living comes from the heart. Don't get caught up on just what you see. Don't get caught up on the fruit that is obvious, because fruitfulness reveals what is treasured in your heart. And it's easy for us in our world today to give attention to the things that are on the surface. It's easy for us today in our world to give more attention and more credence and more value to the things that are readily observable, and to skip over issues of the heart. But Jesus wants us to know this morning that the condition of your heart is important, that the condition of your heart is essential. I may not be able to see your heart clearly, but God can. I may not be able to see everything in your heart, but true fruitfulness emerges from what is treasured in your heart. The good actions that Jesus describes as good fruit, the good living that Jesus describes as good fruit on a good tree, the good that flows from our heart, it doesn't flow from the surface, it flows from what is treasured in your heart. And so what he's saying indirectly here is, cultivate your heart. Take time. Take time. How do we deposit those treasures in our heart that are going to lead to good, that are going to lead to fruit, that are going to lead to the things that God is pleased with? He helps us in the next illustration that he provides to think about that a little bit more. Look how our actions in life proceed from our hearts. And give attention to your heart. Don't neglect your heart. Don't neglect to treasure the things in your heart that God treasures. I love a quote that I read yesterday from Louis Giglio. He said, "When was the last time you were sitting next to someone in church that you brought?" Listen, I want to let that hang for just a minute. What does that have to do with a fruit tree? What does that have to do with peaches? When was the last time you were sitting next to someone in church that you brought? You see, that's the peach. That's the observable evidence of something that you treasured in your heart, which is, I love people. I want people to know Jesus. I want them to know God. I realize there are lots of ways to introduce people to God. Louis Giglio happened to choose church as an example of that. There are lots of other ways that you can minister to people about God and share God with people other than bringing them to church. But that's one way. And so he got a hold of an observable fruit that reveals something in your heart. That in my heart, one of the things I treasure is, I treasure the love of God, the gospel. I treasure the people around me as valuable and needing to know Jesus. I treasure them enough that the good fruit that you see results from the way that I love them in my heart. I like that question. It's a good question. I want you to take that home with you. And then next Sunday, when you have someone sitting beside you that you brought, you can raise your hand a little bit and just wave at me during the message. Fair enough? Look at this next part. He says this. He says, think about it. Somebody that does the things that I have taught them is like a man building a house. First question is your life fruitful? The second question is your life strong enough to survive the storms of life, to withstand the storms of life? Is your life strong enough? Check it out. Jesus says that someone who does what I teach, someone who hears my words and then lives accordingly, someone who is obedient, is like a man who goes and digs deep in his foundation. Now, I love the way that Luke presents this in Luke chapter 6 because, and it's appropriate that this is the case, but I've always given attention to the fact that the wise man built his house upon a rock, the foolish man built his house upon the sand. And the obvious lesson is this, that the wise man has Jesus as his foundation. Jesus is the rock that your life is built upon. And that is true, and that is right, and that is good. But I love what Luke says in terms of action. Luke says that the wise man, the man who does what Jesus says, the man who is obedient to Jesus, the wise man dug deep. Did you catch that? Did you catch that? It says he's like a man who's building a house, who dug deep and laid a foundation. He dug deep. Now, when I read that, for some reason, one of the things that I thought about more deeply than I have before, pardon the pun, is that he dug deep. It's not just about the foundation, but it's about the action. And here's the interesting thing about that. This obedience that Jesus is talking about, that results in the kind of life that will withstand storms, this obedience, this faithfulness to the teachings of Jesus, this faithfulness that results in a life that is strong enough to stand, begins with digging deep to lay the foundation. Now, here's some things I would say about that. First of all, it takes effort to be an obedient follower of Jesus. It takes effort every time. And I have no idea in my mind how many times I've planted shrubs and trees and bushes. Every time I have had the same conversation when I was digging the hole. Well, I know it says it needs to be 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, but why in the world does it need to be 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide? Because it seems to me that 1 feet, maybe 18 inches, especially when I get about the 18 inches and say, well, the root ball will fit in the hole now, so we're good. Every time I've ever had to dig a hole, I've wanted to dig the hole smaller. The moral of that story is, I'm lazy. No. The moral to that story is, it takes effort to follow Jesus. I don't know of a single mature follower of Jesus that has ever told me that my spiritual character and my spiritual maturity happened by accident. I don't know of a single person that I look up to and I see them as an elder in the Lord and as a mature Christian and as someone that I trust that they know God and they love God and they serve God. And I've been blessed in my life with a lot of people of faith that I admire and I respect and I learn from and I grow from. I don't know a single one of them that would say, it just happened. It just happened. It takes effort to follow Jesus. Now, I'm not talking about salvation by works. I'm not talking about God's grace. None of our effort, none of our works will ever save us. I'm talking about character development. I'm talking about maturity. I'm not talking about salvation here. I'm talking about growing up. I'm talking about the fruit of the Spirit. I'm talking about long suffering. I'm talking about the things that God intends for us in terms of having a house that will stand when the wind's blowing and having a testimony that will stand when the storms come. It takes effort. He dug deep The foundation is Jesus. It will never be anything other than Jesus. The foundation of my life will never be dependent upon anything but Jesus. However, there's some things in my life I have to dig deep. I have to put forth some effort. I have to invest myself in Jesus. I have to be willing to dig deep. It takes effort to be an obedient follower of Jesus. And Jesus said, there are lots of people who are listening to me teach. There are lots of people that are hearing and they'll say, Lord, Lord, I heard you. And he said, but here's what it takes to have a kind of house that's going to stand when the storms come. You dig deep. And you dig deep enough to the foundation. Here's the thing that reemphasizes what I was saying about the fruit tree is, understand this, a foundation doesn't show. A foundation is a part of your life that doesn't show. It's not showy. It's not. I've seen a lot of beautiful homes in my life. I don't remember ever visiting someone and saying, oh man, your foundation is beautiful. I know you want to show me the living room and the dining room, but I just want to stand out in the yard and imagine what a foundation. It's beautiful. Beautiful. I don't need to see inside. Foundation's what I'm all about. We get caught up in that in our Christian life. We want people to see what shows, but Jesus is talking about foundation. He's talking about there's a definition that your character is who you are when no one is watching. We get so concerned about the things in life that show, that our image, that what we can portray, what we can convince, what we can persuade, what kind of picture can we show of ourselves? And Jesus says, let me just turn the tide a little bit here and say, what doesn't show is really important. The treasures of your heart are going to translate into fruitfulness. What you value inside of you will translate into a life that can withstand any storm. If you dig deep, if you put forth the effort to be a faithful and obedient follower of Jesus, you're not always going to get all the accolades of people that see stuff. You're not always going to get the recognition. You're going to have people visiting your house because it's the prettiest house on the street. You're going to have a life that will stand no matter how hard the wind blows. And a lot of times that has everything to do with what doesn't show. It's digging deep. It's prayer when nobody hears you but God. It's digging into His Word when you say, God, I don't know what to do, but God, show me something in your Word. Not on Sunday morning when everybody knows you're reading the Bible. I'm talking about the middle of the night. I'm talking about when there is no one but you and God. That's when that foundation is being poured in your life. That's when you're getting the stuff that will help you stand when the storm comes unexpectedly. It's when nobody sees and what nobody knows. And Jesus is saying, it's like building a house. He dug deep, and then the foundation comes. And when the house was built, nobody could see it, but it was there. And he didn't say this. He didn't say this, but let me just suggest something to you. Perhaps from the outside, both of the houses looked the same. Can I just say that when I read this, that's the impression I get? That when you walk up the street and you have a house on the left that has a foundation and a house on the right that doesn't have a foundation, before the storm comes, can I just tell you that when I read that, I think they look the same on the outside? Because sometimes we can look okay on the outside until the storm comes. Crisis reveals character. There's no two ways about it. Storms, there is a blessing in storms. There have been multiple times that storms in my life have revealed that my foundation was faulty. And it took a storm for me to realize that I took a shortcut and I didn't dig a deep enough hole. And I didn't pour a solid foundation. And when the storm came, God used that storm to reveal that I hadn't done my work. in terms of investing in my foundation, that I had fooled myself, that I had fooled, nobody could see it from the outside, but God knew my heart needed help. And a loving God sent a storm in my life and said, let me just show you where you need to work on your character. Let me help you with that. Let me reveal. Let me use the wind to blow away the facade. Let me use the storm to blow away some things in your life that you thought made you who you were. I make you who you are. I give you your identity. He dug deep. He dug deep. And the reason he dug deep, because he knew what didn't show was more important than what was on the surface. He knew that. Jesus taught them that. And we invest so much in our life on the things that are on the surface. Somebody say, yeah, that's right. We really do. We think that what's out here is what matters. But it's not. Jesus said, out of the treasures of your heart, what's on the inside that doesn't show, that's where the fruit comes from. That's where it comes. It's a daily investment in things that matter on the long haul. Pastor Phil and I were talking about this passage this week, and he said, you know what, it's not just about the storms on the outside. And Pastor Phil he knows a little bit more about construction than I do. Okay, a lot. And he said, you know what? He said, you know what, Pastor? He said, it's not just about the storms, but he said, if you don't have a good foundation, you got to worry about stuff like termites. You got to worry about the threats from within. He said, it doesn't just protect the house from the outside. Listen, sometimes the storms that rage the worst are from the inside. Sometimes it's the termites, isn't it, Phil? Sometimes it's the stuff that eat us up. You know, I do know a little something about termites, that you don't always know they're there until it's too late. Because they're chewing and they're working and they're destroying, and pretty soon they're eating up. They're eating up stuff. And he said, you know, you got to have a foundation there to protect you from the enemies that come from within. What a good word. What a good reminder. Because a lot of times we think about the storms that come out here. But a lot of times what's eating at us because of our lack of foundation is coming from the inside out. It's discouragement. It's doubt. It's fear. It's bitterness. It's unforgiveness. It's anger. It's pride. Those are the things that come on up like a termite on the inside, and they're chewing and they're chewing and they're chewing and they're eating away your peace. And they're eating away your character. And they're tearing away at the man or the woman of God that God has intended you to be. And it's time to go back. Here's the good news. Oh, it's good news. I would hate in the real world to have to go back and dig the foundation after the house is built. But here's the beautiful thing about Christ. It's never too late to dig deep and get your foundation in Jesus. It's never too late. You could have come in here this morning and you've built your life according to your plans. And there isn't anything worse than have a construction project where you got to go back and start all the way over again. But God has made a way in our lives that you can do that today. You can do that today. You can do that today. You could begin today receiving this word today and saying, you know what? His word is true. The words of Jesus, they're true. And I want to live that way this week. And guess what you're doing? When you start walking obediently this week, when you start living it Monday and you start living it Tuesday and you start talking to God Monday, you start praying on Tuesday, you start forgiving on Wednesday, you start loving on Thursday. You know what you're doing? You're digging a foundation. You're digging a foundation, and it's just like a big truck is dumping in the concrete, the rock. It's like God begins to put more Jesus in your life, the rock that you can stand on. And he'll begin to do things in your character. I referred to the fruit of the Spirit a moment ago, and I want you to understand that the fruit of the Spirit is the fruit of the Spirit. That's the Spirit of God. Just like that concrete's being delivered, that's the Spirit of God pouring in the character of God in your life. But it happens on the inside, and it flows out in the way we are faithful and obedient to God. I want to close this morning in just a moment. I want to read a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He said this. He asked a question. He said, "How then do the disciples of Jesus differ from the heathen? What does it really mean to be a Christian?" Bonhoeffer was asking that at a time when a question really needed to be asked, because he's caught up in a Germany that is doing a lot of things in the 40s and with the rise of Hitler and all of the atrocities that were taking place around him. And so he's writing things at a time that is critical and crisis in his country. And he asked the question, what does it really mean to be a Christian? What does it really mean? How are we different? If both houses look the same from the outside from the street corner, if both of them what's the difference? And Jesus comes along and says, I'll tell you the difference. I'll tell you the difference. A good tree from the treasures of the heart is able to produce good fruit. I'll tell you the difference. There's a house that a man built that withstood the violent storms of life that came, the termites from the inside that tried to plague. The character of that house was such that it stood. It stood. It wasn't ruined. That's the difference. And how do we do that? We listen to Jesus. We follow Jesus. We dig deep and we walk in his ways by faith. It's a daily faith walk. I love to pray in the mornings and just say to the Lord, look, by faith today, I'm going to follow you. By faith today, I'm going to obey you. By faith today, I'm going to live in a way that you want me to live. It's faith in Jesus. And I'm calling you to that faith this morning. Build your house so that it'll stand. Let's pray together.